On the morning of March 12, 1928, the most trusted engineer in America stood at the foot of this dam, looked at the muddy water leaking through its base, and told everyone it was safe. By midnight, the dam was gone, and so were 431 people. This is the St. Francis Dam. It caused the second worst disaster in the history of California, and today almost no one remembers it happened. Part of that is because the man who built it spent the rest of his life trying to disappear. And part of it is darker, because the warning was right there, in the water, the morning before it broke. Everyone saw it, and the one man everyone trusted looked at it and said, it was nothing. To understand how that happened, you have to understand him. His name was William Mulholland, and in Los Angeles in the 1920s, he was something close to a god. He had no engineering degree. He'd taught himself, started as a ditch digger, read textbooks by lamplight after 12-hour shifts, and worked his way up to running the entire water supply of a growing city. He was brilliant, stubborn, and completely self-made. And in 1913, he did the thing that made his name permanent. He built an aqueduct 233 miles long, reached into the Owens Valley, took an entire river, and carried it across the desert into Los Angeles. Without that water, the city could never have grown. With it, it exploded. When the aqueduct finally opened, 40,000 people came to watch the water pour down. Mulholland turned to the crowd and said 5 words that are still part of the city's history. There it is. Take it. After that, Mulholland could do no wrong. Whatever he built, Los Angeles trusted completely and without question, but the river he'd taken had made him enemies. Up in the Owens Valley, the farmers he'd drained dry were furious. By the mid-1920s, some of them had started fighting back with dynamite, blowing holes in the aqueduct again and again, trying to cut the city's water off at the source. So, Mulholland decided Los Angeles needed insurance. A backup. A massive reservoir close to the city, kept full, so that if the aqueduct was ever blown apart, no one would go thirsty. He chose a canyon in the dry hills to the north, San Francisco Canyon, and there between 1924 and 1926, his crews poured a curved wall of concrete more than 180 feet tall, built to hold back nearly 12 billion gallons of water. It was his design, his calculations, his responsibility, from the first bag of cement to the last. And while it was going up, he changed his mind. Twice, to store more water, he raised the height of the dam, first by 10 feet, then by another 10. But he never widened the base to match. The dam grew taller and heavier, holding back more and more pressure, while it stood on the same footing it had started with. On paper, the numbers still worked. On paper. What the numbers couldn't account for was the ground underneath, and the ground was hiding something. The eastern wall of the canyon wasn't solid rock. It was the frozen wreckage of an ancient landslide, a hillside that had already collapsed once, thousands of years before, and settled into a slope that only looked stable. The western side was a reddish rock that seemed strong and dry. But soak it in water, and it crumbled in your hand like wet sugar. Mulholland had anchored a 12 billion gallon dam to 2 kinds of ground that could not be trusted to hold water. And here's the part that makes it almost forgivable. In 1928, the science to recognize that danger barely existed. Nobody yet knew how to read what was buried in that canyon. But the ground didn't stay silent. It started sending warnings almost the moment the reservoir began to fill. The problem was, everyone had been trained to ignore them. Cracks appeared in the concrete through 1926 and 1927, long ones, running across the face of the dam. Mulholland inspected them and called them normal. And he had a point. Every concrete dam cracks a little as it cures and settles. He sealed them and moved on. Then, the leaks began. Water started seeping out of the canyon walls right beside the dam. On its own, again, not unusual. Mulholland had drains installed to carry it away. Meanwhile, the reservoir kept climbing. By the first week of March 1928, it was nearly full, higher than it had ever been. The full weight of all that water pressing on the foundation for the very first time. And then, on the morning of March 12th, the dam keeper found something that turned his stomach. His name was Tony Harnischweger. He lived in a small cottage at the foot of the dam with his partner and his young son, close enough that the water was a constant sound in their lives. That morning, walking the base, he found a fresh leak. And this one was different from all the others. The water coming out wasn't clear. It was muddy. Brown. To an engineer, that one detail should have set off every alarm there was. Clear water finding a path through is annoying, but survivable. Muddy water means something else entirely. It means the water is carrying the ground out with it, that the foundation is dissolving, washing away from under the dam grain by grain. Muddy water is a dam telling you it's losing its grip. Tony picked up the phone, called Los Angeles, and reached William Mulholland. This is the moment the whole disaster turns on. Mulholland didn't send an assistant. He came himself. He drove out with his right-hand man, and the two of them spent more than 2 hours examining the dam and that muddy leak. Think about what that means. The most respected engineer in the state, 72 years old, decades of triumph behind him, was standing directly in front of the warning sign. He had the authority to do one simple thing: open the gates, drain the reservoir down, and take the danger out of the canyon. A few feet lower, and the pressure eases. Empty it enough, and the cottage and the towns downstream are safe no matter what happens to the concrete. He looked at the muddy water, and he talked himself out of it. There was a new road being cut into the hillside nearby, and he decided the mud was just runoff from that work, not the dam's foundation at all. The leak, he concluded, was normal for a dam this size. He declared the St. Francis Dam safe. He got back in his car, and he drove home to Los Angeles. It was the last engineering decision of his life that anyone would ever trust. That night, the canyon went quiet. Tony and his family were asleep in the cottage at the foot of the dam. Downstream, in the dark, more than 1,000 people slept, in farmhouses, in work camps, in small towns strung along the riverbed for 50 miles. At 3 minutes before midnight, the St. Francis Dam failed. It didn't go slowly. The eastern side, that ancient sleeping landslide, let go all at once, and the dam tore loose from the canyon. 12 billion gallons of water came through in a wall that started higher than a 10-story building and moved at the speed of a car. The cottage was the first thing the water touched. Tony, his partner, and his little boy were gone in an instant. Tony's body was never found. 1.5 miles downstream sat Powerhouse Number 2, a hydroelectric station with a camp where workers lived with their wives and children. The flood reached it minutes later and erased it from the earth. Buildings, beds, families, gone in seconds. And then, it kept going. This is the part that's almost impossible to picture. The water poured out of the canyon and into the Santa Clara River Valley, and it ran for 54 miles, through Castaic Junction, past Fillmore, through Santa Paula, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It took 5.5 hours to reach the sea. Almost everyone in its path was asleep when it arrived. Some had a few minutes of warning, and that warning saved hundreds of lives. As the flood tore down the valley in the dark, telephone operators stayed at their switchboards, calling town after town ahead of the water instead of running for their own lives. A motorcycle officer rode through the lower valley with his siren screaming, pounding on doors, shouting at people to get to high ground. Because of them, some towns emptied just in time. But many people never woke at all. They heard a sound like a freight train in the night. And then there was no more time. By dawn, the Santa Clara Valley was a 50-mile field of mud, shattered houses and the dead. Survivors found bodies tangled high in trees, half buried in silt, carried miles from the beds they'd gone to sleep in. No one has ever counted them exactly. The official figure is at least 431. But the bodies kept surfacing for years afterward, in the riverbed along the beaches, some carried out to sea and recovered far down the coast. Many of the dead were migrant farm workers no one had been keeping records of in the first place. The true number is almost certainly higher. It may be much higher. It remains the deadliest failure of any American-built structure of the entire 20th century. For decades afterward, people argued about whose fault it really was. Was it the design, the raised height, plain negligence? It wasn't until the 1990s that a geologist went back, re-examined the canyon foot by foot, and finally proved it. The eastern slope had been an ancient landslide all along, and the rising reservoir had soaked into it for 2 years, until, that night, it woke up and slid, and took the dam with it. Mulholland's real mistake was never the concrete. It was choosing that canyon at all, and trusting ground that the science of his time was simply blind to. But he didn't have that answer in 1928. All he had was the inquest, and when it came, William Mulholland did not run from it. He could have blamed the geology, the contractors, the impossible rock no one understood yet. Some of that would even have been true. Instead, he stood in front of the jury and took all of it onto himself. "Don't blame anyone else," he said. "You just fasten it on me. If there was an error in human judgment, I was the human." And then, more quietly, he said something no one in that room ever forgot. He said he envied the dead. The jury cleared him of criminal blame. The failure, they ruled, came from the foundation itself, ground no engineer of that era could have read, but they left behind a warning that outlived everyone involved. The safety of a structure like this should never again rest on the judgment of one single man. For Mulholland, it didn't matter. The man who had carried a river to Los Angeles, who had built the city's whole future with his own 2 hands, was finished. He resigned. He stopped appearing in public. He spent his last years silent and broken, and he died in 1935, while the city he'd built was already paving over the canyon where it had all gone wrong. But the disaster did leave one thing behind that mattered. Within a year, California passed laws putting every dam in the state under independent expert review. No more lone genius signing off alone. No more single point of failure built out of one man's certainty. Every major dam in America today is safer because of what the water did in that canyon that night. One piece of the dam survived the collapse. A lone wedge of concrete left standing in the ruined canyon, jagged and gray against the sky. People started calling it the tombstone. It stood there for 2 years, until so many sightseers came to climb it that one of them slipped and died, and the city dynamited it into rubble, as if it wanted the last evidence gone. And in a way, it got its wish. Today, almost no one in Los Angeles knows this happened. There's no famous memorial, no movie. The second worst disaster in California history, 431 people, and probably far more, is a story most of us were never told. Which brings us back to that morning. The muddy leak. The most trusted engineer in America, standing in the exact spot where the danger was, deciding it was nothing. They didn't ignore the warning because they were fools. They ignored it because the man telling them it was safe had never been wrong in his life, and because the thing that was about to kill them was buried in ground that nobody yet knew how to read. That's the part worth holding on to. Catastrophes like this one almost never come from villains. They come from good people, trusting the wrong certainty on the last quiet night before everything they built comes down on top of them. The dam was safe. Everyone said so, right up until 3 minutes before midnight,